Hello and welcome to the Wheels of History Podcast, Episode 7. I'm your host, Brian Boyles. To start, I would want to thank you for your patience since the last episode was published. Production of this episode was considerably delayed due to moving my family halfway across the country and getting settled in at our new duty station. Furthermore, I would rather take a bit more time to ensure that the quality and depth of these episodes are up to par instead of rushing to get an episode out. Along those lines, I decided to split this episode into two separate episodes. This one is going to focus on the Chinese attack on 8th Army forces in the West, and the next one is going to focus on the encirclement of the 1st Marine Division and Army units at the Chosin Reservoir. This episode is going to be a bit longer than my typical one because I found a lot of very gripping first-hand accounts of these battles in my research, and I wanted to paint those in greater detail than the previous episodes. On a quick admin note, I'm going to publish the bonus episode for this series next. As usual, the bonus episode will cover some background on why I chose to do a series on the Korean War. I'll talk a bit about myself and the 3 years I was stationed in Korea. I'll do a deep dive into the sources I used to research the Korean War, and I'll talk a bit about the military equipment involved in the conflict. This bonus episode is available exclusively for my Patreon supporters, both the subscribers who have access to all bonus episodes that I'll ever produce, or people who make a one-time $5 purchase to gain access to the bonus episode for just this series. In recognition of your support, all of my subscribers who support me at the $10 a month producer tier will be able to submit questions that they would like me to answer during this bonus episode. I'm going to open up a post on Patreon that will be open for 2 weeks for any questions you may have. If you aren't a supporter, please consider joining. It helps cover the costs for hosting the website and encourages me to devote the time to make high-quality episodes and share these stories from history with you. And as a side note, if you're an iOS user, Apple is going to add a surcharge to the Patreon fees, so the price will appear to be higher if you try to subscribe or purchase on those devices. So if you're using an iOS app to go to Patreon, please make any purchases on a different device or browser so you can get the actual lower price. Alright, on to the episode. We left off at the end of the last episode with UN forces sending the North Koreans back north of the 38th parallel, falling back in disarray thanks to General MacArthur's bold amphibious landing at the port of Incheon. This landing, far in the enemy rear, threatened to cut off the North Korean army around Pusan. China then warns the UN forces to stay south of the 38th parallel, and if not, they would send troops to the conflict. But MacArthur presses forward, determined to finish the war, and he is sure that the Chinese intervention is just a bluff. Reconnaissance planes don't indicate any Chinese troops in Korea, and MacArthur is sure that if any Chinese units did intervene, UN air supremacy would ensure there would be, quote, the greatest slaughter, end quote. Pyongyang falls and North Korean resistance evaporates until suddenly, on October 25th, some 50,000 Chinese soldiers emerge from the mountains and maul 3 ROK divisions and a U.S. Army regiment. There's tough fighting for a week, and then, on November 6th, the Chinese troops disappear into the mountains. After a few weeks of caution, MacArthur gathers his forces for one last offensive, hoping to end the war by Christmas. Based on the earlier attacks, his intelligence officer revises his estimates and now thinks there are maybe 40 to 70,000 Chinese in Korea, but they don't consider them a serious threat. In reality, there are 300,000 Chinese soldiers hidden in the hills, concealed from aerial observation, and waiting for UN forces to walk into their trap. As UN forces prepare to resume their offensive just after Thanksgiving, there's a sense that the war has changed from the freewheeling pursuit of September and October. Especially at the lower echelons, they know that the Chinese soldiers are out there in the mountains, somewhere. But MacArthur is determined to win the war decisively. Digging in along existing front lines for the winter would give the communists precious time to recover their forces and dig in their own fortifications. MacArthur, confident in the superiority of UN air supremacy and firepower, doesn't want to give the enemy that breathing space. In spite of the Joint Chiefs of Staff urging MacArthur to hold the current lines, MacArthur isn't willing to consider it since, in his own words, quote, "there is no substitute for victory," end quote. So in his eyes, the only way to do this is to advance northward to the Chinese and Soviet borders. However, the Korean peninsula widens as you get further north from the Pyongyang-Wonsan Waste, where the peninsula goes from being 120 miles wide to over 800 miles along the mountainous border. Furthermore, the road network is very limited in northern North Korea. The only significant roads are along the coastlines. Going into the mountains and valleys of the interior, you find, at best, narrow, winding dirt roads, and this would fragment UN forces into isolated advances and pose a significant logistical challenge to sustain mechanized forces on this limited road net. Even in their existing lines, getting supplies to the UN forces is challenging due to the rapid advance made since September. To supply the 8th Army forces advancing up the western side of the peninsula, they are using the ports of Pusan and Incheon. Bringing in supplies north of Seoul is difficult due to the extensive bombing campaign waged by the U.S. Air Forces since the start of the war. This significantly damaged the already limited road and rail network. For example, at the Taedong River near Pyongyang, the railroad bridge there was destroyed early in the war and it hasn't been repaired yet. Trains have to stop on the south side of the river, unload their cargo, ferry it across, and then reload it on the other side on a different train. The port of Chinampo, close to Pyongyang, has been closed to shipping since its capture earlier in October, and this is because there are a lot of naval mines laid along its 84-mile-long channel. After a painstaking effort, the U.S. Navy in late November has just finished clearing the mines, which promises to ease logistical challenges in the week ahead. This is one of the contributing factors to the lack of winter clothing available for soldiers at the front. To some extent, there was the thought earlier in the fall that the war would be over by Christmas, but this changed significantly with the Chinese counterattack in late October. However, simply getting the trench coats and overshoes and gloves and winter hats to the front was challenging due to the competing demand for ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, and the other necessities the soldiers need to keep fighting. Now, in late October, nighttime temperatures are regularly below freezing, and from personal experience, Korean winters have a particular bite to them, probably due to the cold air coming down the peninsula from Siberia. It's no coincidence that many Korean apartments and residences have heated floors, with archaeological evidence that Korean homes have used these underfloor heating systems going back several thousand years. But now, at the end of November, winter clothing is finally starting to arrive at the front, although only about a third of 8th Army forces have this equipment when the offensive begins. The sense that the war is changing is also found in the air. Up until November, the UN forces had uncontested supremacy in the air, both in terms of quality of planes and the quantity of the planes, as well as the experience of the pilots. However, on November 1st, the first Soviet MiG-15 jet fighters entered combat just south of the Yalu River. These jet fighters are state-of-the-art, outclassing anything UN forces have in Korea in terms of speed. Their top speed is 680 miles an hour, compared to only 600 miles an hour for the F-80 Shooting Star. The only fighter that could match the MiG-15 was the U.S. F-86 Sabre, but none of these units are stationed in the theater. This intervention created an area that came to be known as MiG Alley, which is along the Manchurian border with China, where MiG-15s flying out of Chinese air bases just north of the Yalu River would climb to altitude on their side of the border, safe from UN intervention, and then they'd dart across the border and engage UN aircraft. Now, these MiG-15s are supplied by the Soviet Union, and, at least initially, are flown by experienced Soviet pilots. However, to avoid the specter of World War III breaking out and UN and Soviet forces directly fighting, these planes carry Chinese Air Force markings, and so ostensibly there are no Russians fighting in the war. Never mind the snippets of Russian radio chatter made in the heat of combat, or pilots in combat visually seeing that the MiG-15 pilots do not look like they're Chinese or Korean. But just how the Chinese forces in Korea are officially volunteers, the communists are wary of escalating the conflict from a regional war into a global war. On the American side, a similar motivation leads to restrictive rules of engagement. They are not allowed to bomb Chinese air bases housing these aircraft, nor are they allowed to cross the international border to engage them or pursue them. There are many times when UN pilots can see and detect these MiGs taking off from their air bases, safely climbing to high altitude, and then crossing the border to engage them, and then disengage when the odds turn against them, safe from pursuit. While this is frustrating to the pilots on the ground, at a strategic level, it makes a lot of sense to avoid widening the war. And so, both sides are playing the game where they don't want World War III to break out. And so they're going through these contortions of the rules of engagement and officially not being involved in the war to try and minimize that chance. After all, if UN forces start bombing air bases inside of the Chinese borders, that might bring China officially into the war, and that in turn might bring the Soviets into the war too, and maybe even start the fighting in Europe. Now, looking at the big picture, this Thanksgiving offensive consists of the 8th Army advancing along the west coast of Korea to the Chinese border at the Yalu River. Complementing this advance is 10th Corps, located on the east coast near the ports of Wonsan and Hungham. They will advance north into the mountains, past the Chosin Reservoir, and from there to the border, where they will link up with the 8th Army. Now, this episode is going to focus on the 8th Army's advance and Chinese counterattack in the west, and the next episode will look at the 10th Corps advance, and particularly the 1st Marine Division fighting for its life at the Chosin Reservoir. The pause in operations in November allowed UN forces to resupply them, and in particular to stockpile artillery ammunition for the fight ahead. 8th Army consists of 3 corps, U.S. 1st Corps on the west, U.S. 9th Corps in the middle, and the ROK II Corps on the right. This gives the 8th Army 4 U.S. divisions, 4 ROK divisions, and about a division worth of UN forces, mostly consisting of Turks and British troops. There is a gap between the ROK II Corps and the western units of 10th Corps along the Taebaek Mountains, which run north and south along the Korean Peninsula. However, despite myths about Chinese soldiers infiltrating through these mountains and outflanking UN forces, the reality is that those mountains are so rugged and impassable, they pose a significant obstacle to even light infantry foot movement, and so no major combat formations advance through this mountains from either side during the campaign. MacArthur flies out to visit the front on November 24th, the day the offensive kicks off, and he assesses that enemy resistance is light. He thinks that UN air power has successfully isolated the battlefield from further Chinese reinforcements, and that all is well. And indeed, things do go well, at least at first. Across the front, UN forces encounter light opposition. Now, there are reports of larger Chinese forces withdrawing ahead of the advance, but the only significant resistance is encountered by the ROK II Corps in the east. Indeed, the bigger threat seems to come from North Korean guerrillas operating in the rear areas. These are bypassed North Korean army units, some operating in battalion strength along the mountainous regions a little bit east of Pyongyang. And indeed, the day before the offensive kicks off, some 1,500 North Korean guerrillas attack supply depots and hospitals in the rear area of the ROK II Corps, forcing them to commit one of their reserve divisions to stop the North Korean guerrilla forces. The U.S. forces advance cautiously and deliberately. Contrary to some assertions that the U.S. forces were road-bound and never took to the hills, this was not always the case. For instance, the 38th Infantry Regiment, part of the 2nd Infantry Division, has their infantry take the high ground on each side of the road before advancing. However, the hills are high and the ridges are steep, and it takes the infantry over 4 hours to climb to the top of the ridge, leaving the men exhausted and strung out. Furthermore, U.S. Army forces are facing problems of a laid-back attitude and poor discipline. The soldiers think the war is almost over. The fighting is light, the enemy seems to have retreated, and so many of them end up abandoning their steel helmets because they're heavy, and with light enemy opposition, why would I want to wear that when I can just wear a nice warm pile cap instead? They discard their bayonets and carry a reduced ammunition load, typically a single grenade and about 50 rounds of rifle ammunition, whereas the standard load was at least 88 rounds of ammunition. On November 25th, the ROK I Division, operating on the west flank with 1st Corps, they capture a Chinese captain who is a deserter. And interestingly, many of the Chinese forces committed to Korea are actually former nationalist Chinese soldiers who defected to the communists during the Chinese Civil War. At an individual level, many of these Chinese troops have sympathies towards the United States for their support throughout World War II, and they have a desire to flee the communist regime. So this is the case for this captain here, and he reveals the locations of most of the Chinese 13th Army Group, 4 of its 5 armies. And remember, in the Chinese army structure, an army is equivalent in size to a U.S. Corps. And he says that the Chinese are waiting for the UN forces to advance into their trap, and then they'll cut off the roads and annihilate their forces. This information is passed up the chain of command, but it goes largely unheeded. That very night, the 25th to 26th of November, the Chinese forces finally strike the UN, and this time they hit hard. Their attack is weighted particularly in the east against the ROK II Corps and the U.S. 2nd and 25th Infantry Divisions in 9th Corps. The ROK troops are particularly vulnerable, in part because 2 of their divisions were mauled in the earlier fighting in late October, and they're still being reinforced and rebuilt. And in general, the ROK divisions have significantly less firepower than a U.S. division. They have fewer automatic weapons, less artillery, and few armored vehicles. Though both the ROK and U.S. divisions have similar numbers of soldiers, a ROK division only had about a third of the firepower of a U.S. division. Plus, the quality of leadership and soldiers in the ROK Army was also a concern given that the pre-war ROK Army had been virtually destroyed at the onset of the war and has been rebuilt from scratch in the middle of the conflict. To keep from jumping around the different parts of the front, I'm going to focus first on the Chinese attack on the ROK II Corps and how that developed over the next several days, and then I'll go back on how the Chinese attacks fell on the other elements of 8th Army. And as a caveat, there are not a lot of detailed accounts of what happened to the 2nd Corps, because the ROK Army at the time did not keep many written records, and you can hardly blame them. They're trying to rebuild their shattered army while fighting a desperate war for their very existence, and in that environment, paperwork takes a distant back seat when it comes to priorities. Most accounts of what happened to the 2nd Corps come from the KMAG advisors that the U.S. had embedded with ROK formations and events that involved interactions between the ROK forces and adjacent U.S. units. The ROK II Corps was not in great fighting shape. It had 3 divisions, but of those, one of them, the 6th ROK Division, was still recovering from the losses it had taken in the previous Chinese offensive, and they only had 1 regiment combat effective. Furthermore, the large guerrilla attack in the 2nd Corps rear areas disrupted their operations and required committing their reserve forces to contain. In general, the Korean soldiers had poor discipline, building fires to keep warm at night, thus revealing their positions to the enemy, and they were prone to firing their rifles and machine guns at random, or more likely at noises they heard in the night, instead of maintaining fire discipline and keeping their positions concealed. This allowed the Chinese soldiers to get excellent reconnaissance information on where to strike or where not to strike, particularly the locations of key weapon systems like machine guns and where unit boundaries are at. Unit boundaries are particularly vulnerable points in an army because of the challenges of coordinating a response along those boundaries, because now you have 2 separate commanders and 2 units that need to coordinate and work together. There's a greater risk of friendly fire or misidentification, since the different units are employing their own radio networks and call signs, and in many cases there is a physical gap between the units at the boundary. This can be mitigated in planning and operations by designating link-up points at the boundaries for units to share information or coordinate their actions, but it still poses a significant challenge and weakness in combat operations. In general, the Chinese forces would attack at night to exploit their ability to infiltrate right up to or even past defensive positions, and to limit the ability of UN forces to employ their air power or artillery fire. As night would fall, Chinese forces would typically fall back to an assembly area to rest, reorganize, and resupply, and then prepare for their attack. Chinese forces had no radios once you got below the regimental level, and so this regrouping would serve as a way for Chinese commanders to disseminate their orders to their subordinate units prior to an attack. Once it began, a Chinese attack was very much on rails in the sense that they had limited flexibility to react to unexpected situations. Battalions had field telephones to reach subordinate units, but this wasn't a viable option during an offensive operation. And so, outside of couriers passing messages along, they had to rely on prearranged signals and well-rehearsed battle drills. Battalions would employ signal flares for these purposes, and while companies would use bugles and platoons had whistles. After this preparation, the Chinese forces would move forward to their attack positions, usually a 3 to 4 hour march from their assembly areas, and then go into the attack. The Chinese benefited from the long winter nights. At this time in Korea, sunset occurred around 5:15 p.m., and sunrise wasn't until 7:30 in the morning. The Chinese forces had a lot of experience in night combat, especially going back to their experiences fighting in the Chinese Civil War, and so they were well prepared for these types of operations. An American advisor attached to the ROK 10th Regiment wrote of this Chinese attack on their forces, saying, quote, "The early part of the evening was quiet and peaceful. At 2100 hours, the entire Corps front, covering a distance of 100 miles, erupted with a violence that had not been witnessed previously in the Korean conflict. The Chinese launched simultaneous attacks in overwhelming numbers against the front, flank, and rear of the 8th, 10th, 21st, 16th, and 2nd Regiments. An effort was likewise made to eliminate the 3rd and 5th Regiments by multiple penetrations and pincers." End quote. Further down, he also wrote, quote, "The Chinese established defensive positions throughout the area, oriented to the north, along stream beds and ridge lines, so as to complete the destruction of the ROK units after they had been split into small groups by the fury of the initial attack." End quote. And he's describing how the Chinese, once they would infiltrate through or penetrate through the ROK lines, they would then set up defensive positions behind those units, isolating them from reinforcement and resupply, and then allowing their destruction by follow-on Chinese forces. Due to poor communications and a reluctance to report bad news, the 2nd Corps commander didn't get word of the Chinese breakthrough until 5 hours after the attack began. He launches some counterattacks to try and reopen the supply routes to these surrounded units, but they're largely unsuccessful. Now, as daylight comes, the Chinese continue to attack, risking attacks by UN air power in order to press their advantage and keep the Koreans on the run. They end up overrunning a forward airfield, and the forward ROK units began to splinter and fragment into small groups trying to escape to the south. During the day, 8th Army is slowly putting together the pieces about the Chinese attack and are aware of a general threat to their flank in the 2nd Corps sector, but they aren't sure of the specifics. The U.S. 1st Cavalry Division is moved up from the U.S. Reserves to form a backstop behind the ROK 2nd Corps, and the Turkish Brigade is sent to counterattack and try and reopen the roads. The Turkish counterattack initially reports good news. As they advance, reports come in that they have met and defeated a Chinese force in a wild knife and bayonet melee, capturing hundreds of enemy soldiers. However, in reality, they mistook retreating South Korean forces for the enemy and attacked them instead, highlighting some of the challenges and difficulties in interoperability between armed forces of different countries. Later in the day, the lead Turkish battalion does finally meet the Chinese, but they're ambushed and decimated, with only half of that battalion managing to fight their way out of the encirclement, again with extensive knife and bayonet fighting. At an individual level, the Turkish soldiers fought well, but their leadership was indecisive. And as the Turkish brigade fragmented under the Chinese onslaught, they split up into groups of 100 to 200 men, many of them abandoning their equipment and retreating, with some units going as far south as Pyongyang, some 50 miles behind the front lines, before they stop. It takes 2 weeks to reassemble the brigade, and at best they manage to delay one Chinese division for about a day. By dawn on the second day, it's clear that the ROK 2nd Corps is collapsing. General Walker, the 8th Army commander, sends a message to MacArthur and, with some edits for clarity, as the actual message used a lot of abbreviations, it reads, quote, "Indications are that enemy is no longer on defensive, but is taking off action in strength. Main effort at the moment is against 10th Corps, center, and 2nd ROK Corps on our right. No important activity on our extreme west flank, but captured prisoners of war indicate possibility of some strength in that area. We are consolidating positions of 1st Corps until situation clarifies. 9th Corps is resisting strong attacks, but is under orders to resume the offensive. 2nd ROK Corps on the right has fallen back to general line east and west through Tokshan. Situation is that Corps still fluid. 9th Corps is employing Turks to attack Tokshan from the west to assist in stabilizing situation in 2nd ROK Corps, 1st Cav Division being assembled east of Sunshan in rear of ROK as a precautionary measure." End quote. So the initial impression of 8th Army is that this is a local Chinese counterattack, and the ROK 2nd Corps collapsed more due to the lack of staying power in the ROK formations compared to the Americans. However, this impression soon changes. 1st Cavalry Division engages the Chinese forces on November 28th, the 3rd day of the Chinese offensive, as the Chinese have advanced to a depth of 25 miles in some areas by this point. The Chinese hit the 1st Cav Division hard that night, overrunning the 77th Artillery Battalion command post. One of the officers at that command post, Captain Gordon Sumner Jr., is wounded in the action, and he lays still, trying to blend in with the dead soldiers around him. And he watches as 2 platoons of Chinese horse cavalry pass by, followed by 300 infantrymen marching by platoons, and then another 50 who began to dig in around his position. Captain Sumner would eventually be captured, but then escaped 2 days later during an American air attack, and he would go on to fight in the Vietnam War and eventually retire from the Army as a lieutenant general. Meanwhile, the 7th Cavalry Regiment, Gary Owen, is holding defensive positions when the remnants of the ROK 6th Infantry Division try to pass through their lines. Based on past experiences where North Korean troops would try and infiltrate with ROK units, the Cav soldiers have orders to prevent their passage. And indeed, incidents like this actually happened. Lieutenant John Sheehan in the 7th Cav Regiment was questioning some refugees who were mixed in with the ROK column when some North Korean soldiers in the column opened fire and kill him and wound 6 others. However, with the Chinese pressing the ROKs from behind, the soldiers eventually relent and let them pass, and eventually attaching the remnants of the 6th ROK Division, now reduced to regimental strength, to the 1st Cav Division. By November 30th, the ROK 2nd Corps ceases to exist as a fighting formation. The Chinese have advanced about 50 air miles from the start line, exposing the right flank of the U.S. 9th Corps and potentially allowing the Chinese to roll up UN forces from the east. Alright, now we're going to wind back the clock and switch to what happened to the rest of 8th Army and how the Chinese attack fell upon them. So now we're going back to the night of the 25th to 26th November, that same night that the Chinese hit the ROK 2nd Corps. UN forces had been advancing with minor resistance up to this point, only encountering screening forces that the Chinese had deployed forward to keep tabs on the UN advance. So, the night of 25th to 26th November, the Chinese counterattack fell on the 8th Army, with the exception of some 1st Corps forces operating all the way on the west coast. For example, the 1st ROK Division is attacked by 2 Chinese divisions, and the Chinese forces advance some 6 miles into the division. Now the 1st Division is commanded by General Pak Sun-yup, the South Korean Patton, and he commits his reserves to hold off the Chinese attacks, with the help of ample amounts of air power and artillery fire. However, by the 2nd day, his lead regiments have been virtually annihilated, their command posts overrun, and both regimental commanders killed or missing. However, General Pak is a badass, and he goes forward at night in the hours before dawn. He finds most of his scattered units, reforms them into a coherent front line, and then orders a counterattack at dawn. And as would become evident in the months ahead, the Chinese were inevitably able to make some penetrations and gains during the night, but when daylight comes, they could often be pushed back with vigorous counterattacks augmented by air and artillery support. Thanks to General Pak's actions, the ROK 1st Division is able to conduct a fighting withdrawal south along with the other UN forces, withdrawing across the Chongchong River by the sunset of November 29th. Now the 25th Infantry Division, east of the ROK 1st Division and west of the 2nd Infantry Division, is also hit hard. The Chinese assault Ranger Hill, so named because a Ranger company, reinforced by tanks, are occupying it, and in a brutal fight that lasts for hours, the Chinese eventually force the Americans off the hill, inflicting 75% casualties. Elsewhere, the Chinese managed to slip through the front lines and attack the 77th Field Artillery Battalion and overrun a battery of guns before 2 nearby tanks and the other artillerymen rally and break up the Chinese attack. The Chinese excel at being able to infiltrate undetected right up to unit defensive perimeters, often getting within hand grenade range, and that's how they start their attack. They throw a barrage of hand grenades, which are doubly effective because, unlike gunfire, they don't reveal the location of the attacker, and plus they're an area effect weapon, causing significant damage and casualties. However, the Chinese aren't supermen. They just learned from their early battles against the United States the previous month about how effective American artillery and air power is, and so they've tried to align their tactics to account for that. The Chinese distributed lessons learned from that earlier fighting to the other units in their army, containing advice such as, quote, "They specialize in day fighting. They are not familiar with night fighting or hand-to-hand combat. They are afraid of our big knives and grenades. Also, of our courageous attack, regular combat, and infiltration. If defeated, they have no orderly formation. Without the use of their mortars, they become completely lost and are killed off. They become dazed and completely demoralized. They are afraid when the rear is cut off. When transportation comes to a standstill, the infantry loses their will to fight." End quote. However, in spite of their losses during the night and local reverses, the Americans fight hard and inflict significant casualties on the Chinese, especially when the morning comes. For example, after getting kicked off Ranger Hill, the following morning the U.S. shells the hill and then bring an aircraft to fire rockets and drop napalm on it, forcing the Chinese to withdraw with heavy casualties. At this point, I'm going to focus on the fate of the 2nd Infantry Division, both because they were exposed to some of the heaviest fighting in the Chinese offensive, due in part to their right flank being exposed by the collapse of the 2nd Corps, and in part because they served as the rear guard of 9th Corps as UN forces withdrew south. Similar to the other UN forces, they had advanced north following Thanksgiving, encountering only light opposition from Chinese screening forces. They were advancing across the Chongcheng River, which generally goes east from the sea and then turns northeast into the mountains, where the 2nd Infantry Division is now. 2ID is straddling the river on a bend, where it's running north-south, and then the river valley itself is surrounded by hills, mountains, and ridgelines. This compartmentalizes the battlefield, so you don't have battalions on line forming a continuous front. Instead, you have a lot of isolated platoon and company-sized battle positions spread across the front lines. PFC Louis Giudice was a machine gunner in K Company, 9th Infantry Regiment, and his company had marched all day on the 25th, and exhausted, they arrived at the base of a ridgeline. Due to their exhaustion, lack of discipline, and lack of enemy opposition, the soldiers don't send out patrols or establish communications with adjacent units. However, about an hour and a half after sunset, Private Giudice hears bugles sounding off all around him and the sound of trampling men. His position is about 30 feet off of a creek bed in a field, a little bit away from the main company perimeter, and in the moonlight he spots a column of Chinese infantry, 4 abreast, double timing down the creek bed, weapons at the port. He decides to hold fire and watches as column after column of Chinese troops run down the creek bed, interspersed by officers on horseback. It takes 17 minutes for the entire Chinese regiment, that is several thousand troops, to pass. Just after they pass, one of the other riflemen in the company sees them and fires off a few shots. Private Giudice opens fire with his machine gun too, but it jams after only a few rounds are fired. And now the Chinese, alerted to their presence, send a couple hundred soldiers back to search for them, finding his company, and then launching their attack by throwing grenades into the perimeter and then conducting a final assault. The company is overrun, and the company commander, Captain Benton, takes the remnants of a platoon, about 15 men, and tries to escape. Other U.S. soldiers hunker down in the ravines until daylight, and ultimately the Chinese capture about 30 soldiers, including Captain Benton, though he later escaped from captivity during the night. Further downstream, there are 110 men in L Company, who had also been marching all day, and they kept their bedrolls and overcoats with their supply section in the rear. A truck and a jeep are en route to deliver their bedrolls and food and ammo, but those vehicles get lost, and so the commander sends out a patrol to track down the vehicles and guide them into the perimeter. Meanwhile, the men are cold because temperatures are dropping below freezing now, and so the commander authorizes them to build campfires to stay warm. Meanwhile, there are 2 ROK prisoners who had escaped from the Chinese and are hiding in a nearby schoolhouse. They see the aforementioned Chinese regiment run past them, and they remain hidden, and then, seeing the campfires from the American position, go towards them, reasoning that the enemy forces wouldn't be using campfires. Now, as the Chinese regiment passes by the Americans, they also see the campfires, clearly outlining where L Company is, and so they detach a few companies of infantry to approach the perimeter and attack it. The two ROK soldiers enter the U.S. perimeter, warning the Americans, quote, "You are in great danger," end quote. The American soldiers on the perimeter start hearing the sounds of digging in front of them and voices in the darkness, but they're unable to identify who's out there, and they're unsure if they're American soldiers or the enemy. One of the platoon leaders hears someone shout in the darkness in English, "Hey there," and so he responds, "Are you from K Company? If you don't answer, I will fire." The Chinese responded by opening fire on him, and all hell breaks loose. A Chinese signal flare goes off, and the Chinese lob a volley of grenades into the perimeter. At the blast of their whistles, the Chinese stand up from their positions, now completely surrounding L Company, and begin to advance. The American perimeter disintegrates as soldiers flee, despite rallying cries from their officers. And this just shows, adding to the confusion of the Chinese attack, some of the Chinese soldiers are fluent English speakers, and they say stuff, whether it be the "hey there" from this attack, or in other cases they say, "Hey, how many people are in there?" trying to get some intelligence information or just unnerve the U.S. soldiers. Now, the compartmentalized nature of the battlefield due to the terrain and isolated positions means that some units, like I Company, completely escaped contact during the night, despite being only 1.5 miles away from L Company that was attacked and annihilated. A mortar platoon in one position is repeatedly grenaded during the night, with 2 corporals in the platoon becoming very adept at grabbing the grenades and throwing them back before they explode, or kicking them away when they fall at their feet. Over the course of an hour, they throw back some 40 to 60 grenades, and are able to hold off the Chinese attacks with their carbines and their own hand grenades. As they start running low on ammunition, some soldiers crawl out of the perimeter to try to find reinforcements, and they come across another group of mortarmen nearby who have extra grenades, and so they bring them back, which allows them to break the final Chinese attack at dawn. Now, these attacks that fell on these companies and the mortar position are all part of the 9th Infantry Regiment, and that regiment will lose half of their men in the coming days of fighting. This regiment, known as the Manchus, was named this for their role in the Boxer Rebellion, where they were stationed in Manchuria. 2 9 Infantry was one of the units stationed in Camp Casey, Korea, when I was there with 4-7 Cav. Now, the regiment of Chinese troops that ran down the creek bed continued south, minus the troops that split off to deal with K and L companies, and they're en route to the 61st Field Artillery Battalion, located only a few kilometers behind the line. The artillery was pushed this far forward in part because of the expected UN offensive, since you want to position your artillery forward so they can reach deeper into the enemy rear, and then you won't need to relocate them as quickly as the front line advances. They're also located this far forward because of all the mountainous terrain. It doesn't afford many good firing positions for large artillery formations. Now, this artillery battalion is positioned just south of the Chongchong River, armed with 105mm towed howitzers. The Chinese approach at night and cross the Chongchong River, taking off their shoes and trousers, and in some cases stripping completely naked. And remember, it's almost December in Korea, and temperatures are dropping below freezing at night. They wade across the river, with water some 3 to 4 feet deep, and the river being 200 feet across, carrying their weapons and clothes over their heads. Once on the other side, some soldiers take the time to redress before attacking, while others attack without pants or shoes. But regardless, they achieve complete surprise, and the entire battalion is overrun, with the survivors of the artillery battalion abandoning their guns and fleeing south. Some of the soldiers end up fleeing without boots or pants of their own, because they were in sleeping bags when the Chinese attacked, and they have no time to get dressed or take anything with them. The Chinese also hit other U.S. forces along the river, including overrunning the battalion command post of 2 9 Infantry and other infantry positions along the river. PFC Harvey Deshoen of Alpha Company was on outpost duty when he noticed the Chinese soldiers taking off their shoes and pants to cross the river. In the firefight that ensued, the Chinese rushed forward and occupied their 4 defensive positions. The company commander employed a reserve platoon to counterattack, and the infantrymen find the Chinese in the foxholes, as many as 4 to a hole, but the Chinese make almost no effort to fight back. likely because they're freezing cold from crossing the river and hadn't had time to recover. Within an hour, and at the cost of all 3 infantry platoon leaders, the Americans evict the Chinese from their positions. And the next morning, the artillerymen regroup and are able to retake their old positions, and thankfully most of their artillery pieces are still present and operable. Elsewhere, Corporal Ronaldo Acosta is manning an outpost of an infantry company when he suddenly sees a Chinese soldier 10 yards in front of him, who disappears before he can react. At the same time, a master sergeant elsewhere in the perimeter bumps into a man in the darkness just in front of him, and when he challenges him, the soldier rolls away and silence ensues. Then, 2 minutes later, the Chinese open fire en masse on the defensive perimeter. In the ensuing fighting, a U.S. machine gun tracer ignites a small brush fire, and the wind fans it into a blaze. And now, in the midst of the fighting, Chinese soldiers rush over to stomp out the fire, only to be shot by the Americans. This happens time after time again, and then finally, when the fire burns out and there's a pause in the attack, the soldiers hear a bugle blast and a shepherd's horn sounding out of the darkness around them, and they can hear the sound of men's voices in a chant somewhere down the hill amongst the scrub, getting louder and louder. The Americans fire in the general direction of the voices, but before long, grenades start exploding around their positions, and the soldiers still don't have a clear target to shoot back at. By 2 a.m, the company has 5 dead and 26 wounded, and the CO talks to the battalion commander, requesting permission to withdraw. The battalion commander concurs, but they face the challenge now of getting 5 soldiers out of their positions who need a litter to move. Unfortunately, there's no litters available, so the soldiers end up using blankets with 3 soldiers on the side to carry them down the hill, abandoning their food, sleeping bags, and extra ammunition and equipment. In a sense, this helps buy them more time, as the Chinese soldiers spend some time looting the gear left in the perimeter instead of pursuing the soldiers, and so they get clear and call down artillery fire on their old position. However, about an hour later, the Chinese catch up with them again, and the company fragments into 2 groups. One group with the battalion XO in it is coming up to a footbridge, and the group pauses in the shrubs nearby to survey the area before crossing. They hear padded feet running towards them, and they see a whole battalion of 500 soldiers double-timing by in near silence. The Chinese weapons and equipment don't make any clanging sounds at all, and the soldiers are disciplined and don't talk or make noise. All they can hear are the soft thuds of their padded, sneaker-like shoes on the ground, and the Chinese soldiers breathing heavily as they run past. The XO waits 10 minutes after they pass before continuing. Another position, occupied by Golf Company on Hill 291, has 164 men. They're exhausted from climbing to the top of the hill, and they meet and relieve Charlie Company, who had climbed to the hill earlier in the day and hadn't encountered any opposition. The positions Charlie Company had established aren't very well situated. Due to the various knobs at the top of the hill, each platoon battle position doesn't have visual contact with the other platoons or the company command post. Efforts to dig in deeper are fruitless, as the soil gives way to solid rock once you go more than a foot down, and given their exhausted state, they have no desire to change their positions or even send out patrols that night. Only one platoon is able to establish radio contact with the command post, and the rest have to personally make their way to the CP to get instructions. Sometime after midnight, the soldiers hear muffled noises, and a soldier sent to investigate finds hundreds of Chinese digging positions around both sides of the trail leading up their hill. Now, this soldier that was sent to go investigate is a Katusa, a Korean soldier, assigned to Golf Company. He observes 2 companies of Chinese infantry marching by in column, in addition to those digging in along the trail. And so, after watching them pass, he then stands up and empties his carbine into the group and then runs for his life. This, in turn, draws the Chinese to attack the entire company. Their company commander, First Lieutenant Rivet, hears the gunfire and sounds the alert. Belatedly realizing his command post is in a rather poor position, he relocates his men about 150 yards away and hides them in some rocks, trees, and shrubs. Sure enough, the Chinese make it to the top of the hill and sweep the ground where their command post used to be. First Lieutenant Rivet orders his men to hold their fire, and the Chinese, after investigating the hill for about half an hour, end up stopping. The men hear 3 whistle blasts, and then they observe 3 Chinese soldiers walk to the top of the hill and start playing flutes. This goes on minute after minute, and before long many other Chinese soldiers come out and start dancing, posing a very perplexing and interesting sight for Lieutenant Rivet and his men to observe. However, one of Lieutenant Rivet's men decides to open fire, and then, just as quickly as they appeared, the Chinese disappear into the darkness, followed by bugle calls to regroup, and then a hailstorm of machine gun fire and rifle fire on their position. Meanwhile, the 3rd platoon was trying to escape and becomes intermixed with the 2 companies of Chinese arrayed along the trail. The Katyusha who started the whole engagement, An Jong-sup, is part of this formation when a spotter plane sees the firefight and calls in a rocket and napalm strike. As the strike comes in, An Jong-sup charges up the slope through the Chinese and breaks through, but the rest of his platoon is never heard from again. And as he's trying to make his way back to friendly lines, An Jong-sup encounters 2 Chinese soldiers who apparently mistook him for a friendly, and so he shoots both of them at point-blank range and keeps running until he collapses and is found later by the Americans. In spite of this intense fight going on at the headquarters and 3rd platoon, due to the fragmented nature of the company position and the terrain, 1st and 2nd platoons never realize that the rest of their company is in a fight for their lives only 2/3 of a mile away. And I find these accounts of the battle fascinating because it goes so far beyond the sterile reading of casualty numbers and who took what hill. These platoons and companies are in a fight for their very lives, fighting a foe they know little to nothing about in the middle of the night. And it also reveals that on both sides of the conflict are human beings fighting. Yes, the Chinese soldiers are very disciplined, they can stay silent on the move and cross freezing rivers half naked, but they're still individuals with their own fallacies and weaknesses. And far from being part of a faceless mass of human wave attacks, the Chinese studied the strengths and weaknesses of their forces compared to the UN troops, and they did their best to compensate for the disparity in firepower and vehicles. And it may have cost them more casualties than a Western military force would tolerate, but it's the price they were willing to pay to infiltrate around and through the UN lines and convince the UN commanders to pull back. Likewise, on the American side, yes, there are instances of poor discipline and setting out bonfires and not sending out patrols, but their formation, by and large, did not collapse and run away when the Chinese attacked. In most cases, they fought back vigorously and launched their own counterattacks to retake their positions when the daylight came. And meanwhile, the air and artillery fire is inflicting heavy losses on the Chinese. But the Chinese don't stop, and they have many more troops to commit to action. And so, as day by day passes, U.S. forces are getting slowly ground down by the Chinese, and casualties are mounting. After the initial Chinese counterattack, General Walker orders the 8th Army to pull back to the Chongcheng River line, and while 2ID is actually on the river at their positions, further west, that means the U.S. forces were falling back about 10 miles or so to create a defensive line along the river. However, the greatest danger is not in the west, it's in the east, with the collapse of the ROK II Corps. And so, with the flank turned by the collapse of ROK II Corps, General Walker orders a withdrawal further south by about 20 miles. In the west, 1st Corps has a relatively easy time on the withdrawal. As related above, the 1st ROK Division was heavily pressed by the Chinese, but held together and withdrew in good order. And 24th ID along the coast has minimal contact with the enemy, and also withdraws without issue. The center with 9th Corps is a bigger concern due to the heavy Chinese attacks and from their front, and then also on their open flank with the ROK II Corps being decimated. 25th ID withdraws first, and then 2nd ID follows as the rear guard. Now, given the terrain, there are limited routes that 2nd ID can take. They withdraw first to the town of Kunuri along the Chongcheng River, and Kunuri is at the intersection of several roads leading to the south. One of them initially goes west into the 1st Corps sector towards the town of Anju, and then goes south. Another road leads east and then south to Sunshan. This was the main route that 2ID used in their advance north, but it's threatened by the collapse of ROK II Corps and the failure of the Turkish Brigade counterattack, and so this road is now occupied by Chinese troops. Finally, there is a more remote route due south from Kunuri, which winds through a valley and crosses the Taedong River at Sunshan. So, as 2ID is withdrawing to Kunuri, the roads are getting clogged with vehicle traffic and movement is slow, averaging only 2 miles an hour. However, by the 29th of November, some 3 days after the Chinese offensive began, 2ID consolidates at Kunuri, and casualties have been high in the fighting. For example, the entire 9th Infantry Regiment is under 50% strength. The commanding general of 2ID, Major General Lawrence Dutch Kaiser, is concerned both because of his exposed eastern flank and also reports of a Chinese roadblock on the route due south of them. Indeed, a convoy of Turkish reinforcements was ambushed and the stragglers arriving into the perimeter at Kunuri on the 29th. And so in response, since this is the route that 2ID is supposed to pull back on, they send a 20-man military police patrol at dawn on the 29th of November to clear the roadblock, but they're rebuffed with losses. And the reason why MPs are sent on this mission is because route security is one of those combat roles of military police units. Now, after the attack fails, a reconnaissance company is sent to reinforce them, but this attack also fails. And so they commit an infantry company with a tank platoon to try and clear the roadblock. But again, the attack fails. You see, in reality, there's not just one roadblock along the road, but two, with more Chinese soldiers arriving throughout the day. While this is going on, 2ID units, tired and worn down from the past several days of fighting, are reorganizing for the retreat south. The Chinese are giving the Americans little respite, with Chinese troops pressing them from the north. And so the 23rd Infantry Regiment is assigned to hold the northern flank, while the 38th Regiment is reorganizing in the perimeter from their losses earlier in the fighting, and that leaves only 2 understrength battalions from 9th Infantry Regiment to clear the roadblock to the south. The commanding general of 1st Corps, Lieutenant General Frank Milburn, is a friend of General Kaiser, and so he reaches out directly, offering him the use of the Anju Road, the road going west, if needed. General Kaiser ends up sending out his combat trains and wounded soldiers along the route, but he's committed to attacking south because those are his orders from 9th Corps. However, in light of the Chinese roadblock to the south and their inability to clear it during the day, he requests from 9th Corps an attack from the south to link up with them along the route. Ultimately, the British Middlesex Battalion is sent north, but they encounter Chinese forces at the south side of a mountain pass, and they're turned back, but word never gets through to 2ID. And so, throughout the night, the Chinese continue to press on the division and send forces around the flank to block the road to Sunshan. By this point, 4 Chinese divisions are closing on 2ID. 2 Chinese regiments alone are ordered to establish roadblocks along the southern route, far more than the 2ID staff believes is there. And as a sign of how desperate the situation is getting, the 17th Field Artillery Battalion on the evening of the 29th is firing interdiction fires at 18,000 yards distance. But by dawn, they're firing at targets only 1,300 yards away, in some cases so close that the gunners can actually see their rounds impacting. And things are pretty desperate when artillery is starting to engage in direct fire against the enemy. So during the night, the 2nd ID staff develops their withdrawal plan and issues the operations order in the morning. The division is going to fight their way out, with the 9th Infantry Regiment leading the way, followed by the 38th Infantry Regiment, then the division headquarters, then the artillery and engineers, and finally the 23rd Infantry Regiment will serve as the rear guard. However, throughout the night, the depth of the Chinese roadblock increases, so that by the morning time, their position stretched along 6 miles of the road. And to add some context, this is a mountainous, hilly terrain, so the road is the only route that vehicles can take on their way south. There aren't any options to maneuver around or bypass the road. And these Chinese positions are not necessarily physically on the road itself. In many cases, they're in the hills surrounding the road, still able to place effective fires or call for fire on the 2ID soldiers moving down the road itself. At times, these positions are augmented by adding physical obstacles on the road to delay the U.S. forces, usually made up of destroyed or disabled vehicles from earlier attempts to pass through. As the 9th Infantry moves south, it sends men up on the hills overlooking the road, only to find that the Chinese also have positions further back on the hills and deeper than they had expected. And so by 10 o'clock, General Kaiser realizes that the 9th Infantry simply doesn't have the combat power or the time to clear the road. And so he sends the 38th Infantry along the road to push through to the south. Now the 38th Infantry soldiers are exhausted and worn down from the constant fighting. They had only just arrived in the perimeter the night before, and as a measure of their exhaustion, their regimental commander, Colonel George Peploe, fell into a deep sleep on his cot once they finally got the regiment established in the perimeter. His feet, still in overshoes, are only 6 inches away from a warming stove, and before long his overshoes start to smoke. However, the men are unable to wake him up, and they eventually have to move his entire cot out with him on it in order to save him from catching fire. Now, as the 38th Infantry advances south, there is an attached tank company leading the advance. As many soldiers as possible are crowded onto the decks. The lead tank, for example, has 21 men on board. Now, typically when you look at how many infantry are doctrinally supposed to ride on a tank, when you do so, it's typically more like a squad of 9 soldiers. And so these tanks are crowded with as many infantrymen as possible can fit. At each curve, the lead tank is firing the 50 caliber machine gun at potential enemy positions to the front, while the tank riders are firing their weapons to the flanks. The 38th Infantry breaks through the first roadblock without having to stop and deploy, but they are stopped at the second roadblock a few miles south. This is the one where the Turkish convoy from earlier the previous day was destroyed. While the soldiers are trying to clear the roadblock, the infantry dismount, engage any enemy forces they can, and then once the road is clear, they remount and continue the advance south. As Colonel Peploe himself said, quote, "I started through the block with my assigned driver at the steering wheel of my Jeep. After we had gone a short distance, the road turned abruptly to the right, and there blocking the road were some empty vehicles with crews hugging the ditches on both sides of the road. Small arms fire was hitting the position from the nearby ridge on the right, west, side. We tumbled out of the Jeep into the ditch on the left, east, side. Mortar fire from the east fell a short distance to our left. It was necessary to get the vehicles moving, so we scrambled into the Jeep with Manning taking the wheel. It was overloaded with men. With my wounded Korean orderly on my lap, we took off with the other vehicles following." End quote. This process repeated itself over and over throughout the operation, though there were often issues with the tanks departing before all the riders climbed back on. Furthermore, infantrymen riding on the outside of the tanks are rather exposed. After all, a tank is a large vehicle and easy to spot and draws a lot of fire, and the infantrymen on board the tank don't have much in the way of cover to protect themselves. For example, the 3rd tank in the column made it out with only 10 of the original 22 tank riders surviving. As they advance south, the hilly terrain prevents the lead elements from reporting back to the 2ID headquarters what they had encountered, and so throughout the advance south, General Kaiser is still under the impression that the Middlesex Battalion is advancing from the south and they're going to link up in short order, and he doesn't have a clear picture of the depth and level of intensity of enemy opposition along the route. As the 38th Infantry advances south, the 9th Infantry comes down from the hills and prepares to move out. 2nd Battalion loads up on whatever 38th Infantry vehicles they can find and just join the column, whereas the 3rd Battalion forms a perimeter along the road and then comes out near the rear of the division. Thankfully, the advance is aided considerably by the artillery and air power available to the Americans during daytime. Casualties are mounting, and more knocked out vehicles are littering the road. Sometimes the fighting is at close quarters. For example, 2nd Battalion 38th Infantry Regiment, as they were advancing south, were faced with 200 Chinese attacking them from the hills. Lieutenant Colonel Sheldon, the battalion commander, shoots a Chinese soldier at only 30 yards away. Another Chinese soldier is climbing up onto a tank to throw a grenade into an open hatch, only for the tanker to slam the hatch shut at the last minute, cutting off several of the Chinese soldiers' fingers. The division staff mounts up at noon, and due to a lack of available seats, people are loaded up on any vehicle or trailer wherever they can find room. PFC Arthur Cohen, a staff member who caught a ride on a trailer mounted to a Jeep, recalled, quote, "The planes were continually flying over and dropping their napalm, rockets, and machine gun fire at the enemy at a dangerously low position. It appeared as though we could touch the wings of the planes because of the low range at which they were flying. Along the road were scattered just about every piece of equipment that the Army had in Korea. Anything from a 45 caliber bullet to an 8-inch shell could be found, every small arms weapon and some artillery pieces, vehicles of every nature. But worst of all, men. We made an attempt to get all the wounded out that we could, and even the dead, but we didn't even have space to put in our own men, and it hurt just about every one of us to know that we had to leave even our own dead back there." End quote. On the advance south, the air defense artillery played a critical role in helping protect the evacuation column. No, the Chinese didn't have any aircraft engaged in ground support operations, but this was back before the missile era, and so the air defense artillery are armed with half-tracks and tracked vehicles mounting large numbers of 50 caliber machine guns or small caliber cannon. In this case, the M16 and M19 vehicles. M16s are a half-track with a quad 50 cal mount, and the M19 is a tracked vehicle with two automatic 40mm Bofors cannon, and both of them are extremely effective at decimating infantry positions. Furthermore, since they're designed to fire at high angles to engage aircraft, that makes them ideal for hitting positions up in the mountainous terrain. Everyone going south came under fire. General Kaiser's Jeep had 7 bullet holes in it by the time they made it to the south end of the pass, and the CG's bodyguard manning the machine gun was killed, and there are numerous reports of the general himself firing his rifle at the enemy, shouting encouragement to the soldiers, dismounting, fighting, and remounting once again when the road was clear. While this is going on, the 23rd Infantry Regiment, performing the rear guard, is attacked over and over by the Chinese. Colonel Paul Freeman, the regimental commander, began seeking authority to withdraw west via the Anjou Road and tries to talk Devarty into joining him, but Devarty decides to stick with the plan, and there is definitely a last chopper out of Saigon sense in the perimeter. 17th Field Artillery Battalion, while waiting their turn to depart, is near a quartermaster depot, and the soldiers are helping themselves to whatever is available, especially overcoats. When the column finally gets moving, the traffic is bumper to bumper. Some 105mm howitzers deploy to engage enemy positions with direct fire on the route south, and as darkness falls, they continue to push forward. Colonel Walker Goodrich, the Devarty S3, reports what it was like when his column made it to the north end of the pass, which is almost at the end of the gauntlet. He said, quote, "Darkness had set in when the Arty headquarters started up the pass. I, the S3, was in the rear. A quad 50 was immediately ahead. The column was moving at a steady rate, estimate about 10 miles an hour. Only once was I aware of any enemy fire, and that was machine gun fire coming down the road from a draw to the west and just short of the crest. A burst struck the road in the interval between the quad 50 and the S3 Jeep. The machine gun was well positioned to damage, halt, and thereby back up the column." End quote. He then talked about the Ford site at the south end of the pass. Quote, "Next came the dropped bridge. The bypass was as you have described it. The banks had been bladed. Failure to negotiate it slowly in four-wheel drive was the danger, motor flooding and stalling. However, all vehicles ahead had cleared it. There was no enemy fire, nor were there any British." End quote. However, the flow of vehicles that made it through the ford would slow to a trickle and then stop about an hour later, thanks to a prime mover pulling a 155 howitzer stalling in the middle of the ford site. Furthermore, throughout the night, more and more Chinese forces began arriving in the hills, subjecting the ford site itself to increasing amounts of machine gun and mortar fire as the night wears on. This effectively blocks the route of any of the other howitzers trying to get out through the gauntlet, though some smaller vehicles were able to make it through. In the darkness, and amidst the firefight and the desperation to move south, some wounded soldiers are run over on the road, others are rescued, and others still abandoned. There were some officers or men who would stop vehicles to search for the wounded and dead, while others pressed ahead, desperate to escape. Meanwhile, Colonel Freeman with the rear guard finally got approval in the evening to withdraw to the west. The CG was unreachable by comm since he was fighting his way out through the gauntlet at this point, but the Deputy CG, Brigadier General Bradley, authorized the withdrawal. There was a lot of controversy over the 23rd Infantry heading out west instead of continuing to be the rear guard, and sometimes General Kaiser himself was blamed for the order, since this effectively removed the rear guard from the Engineer Battalion and the 2 remaining artillery battalions still on the perimeter, and caused them to take much heavier losses at the end of the night. As Colonel Freeman is preparing his men to withdraw, he asks anyone else in the area if they want to go with him to the west. The 15th Field Artillery Battalion, armed with 105mm towed howitzers, agrees to go with him. To make good their escape, they plan on abandoning their guns after firing off the remaining ammunition, some 3,200 rounds, which they do in 22 minutes. This amounts to an average rate of fire of 8 rounds per minute per gun, which is a very high rate of fire for artillery, and it effectively burns out their barrels, but the barrage of fire shocks the advancing Chinese soldiers, causing them to cease their attack and frantically try to dig in. When darkness falls at 16:30, Freeman's men begin moving west, and his instructions to his soldiers are, quote, "Get the hell out of here and don't stop," end quote. They use white lights to increase their movement speed and avoid accidents, and their withdrawal occurs without incident or enemy pressure. Despite intense criticism for his actions, Colonel Freeman had no doubts. A week after the escape, he wrote for the record, quote, "I realized that I could not have followed the main body down the 2nd Infantry Division withdrawal route. I can also state with every degree of certainty that my force could not have held its rearguard position an hour longer than it did. There is no doubt in my mind that the correct decision was made. I feel that the 23rd RCT made its maximum contribution to the withdrawal of the 2nd Division and could have done no more without annihilation." End quote. Back at Kunuri, the 2 artillery battalions left behind are headed south on the road. The 503rd Field Artillery Battalion hears bugles in the night as they are moving south, and then the Chinese rush their column, overrunning a battery of 155 artillery pieces, looting it, and then vanishing into the hills. Only 22 men survived the attack. The 38th Field Artillery Battalion, towing 105mm guns, is following. Lieutenant Colonel Robert O'Donnell, the battalion commander, goes forward to investigate why the column is halted. He takes 5 bullets from a machine gun burst at 40 yards and crumples to the ground, and another major that's accompanying him is wounded and later captured. Lieutenant Grinnell, part of the 38th Infantry Regiment, is in the column and talks to the battalion S3, recommending they bring up the air defense gun attachment. And he finds 2 M19s and 3 M16s, which arrive and summarily annihilate the Chinese machine gun position blocking the road. Before departing, Lieutenant Grinnell decides to check Lieutenant Colonel O'Donnell's body to make sure he's dead, and to his surprise, he discovers that Colonel O'Donnell is actually alive, just barely, and so they lash him to the lead M19 and they make it through the gauntlet. After the war, Lieutenant Colonel O'Donnell recounted, quote, "When the head of the 38th FA Battalion column was stopped by the tail of the 503rd FA Battalion column, I walked forward to determine the cause of the holdup. Before I reached the head of my battalion column, enemy fire from small arms and mortars hit one of the firing batteries. The battery returned fire and temporarily silenced the enemy. From my existing knowledge of the situation, I realized I was faced with the decision of destroying our howitzers and fighting out on foot, or attempting to continue farther south on the road. The essential element of information lacking was, how effectively was the road ahead blocked? In such a crucial decision, I felt that first-hand knowledge was essential. Accordingly, I instructed Major Kopishki, an executive officer, to assemble the battalion in a defensive area and be prepared for either decision. I walked forward and found Major Lavelle and Major Freilich at the tail of the 503rd column. I asked them to report on the extent of the physical block on the road ahead, and was informed that the 503rd column had been hit hard, but they did not know whether it was possible to get our trucks and howitzers past the damaged vehicles. Without delay, I continued to walk forward with the intention of personally determining the effectiveness of the block. As related by Major Freilich, I was then fired upon and seriously wounded. Believing me dead, Freilich and Lavelle returned to the rear of the 503rd column and informed the 38th officers of my death. From accounts I have since received, Major Kopishki then decided to destroy the materiel and to fight out on foot." End quote. The final unit left at Kunuri is the 2nd Combat Engineer Battalion. With the 23rd Infantry departing along the Anjou Road to the west, they become the de facto rear guard of the division. A portion of the battalion followed the artillery down to the south, but the northern portion of the battalion was overwhelmed in their defensive positions during the night. There aren't many details of what happened in the rear guard, since they were virtually annihilated, with only 266 out of 977 men in the battalion surviving, and very few of these coming from the rear guard. Only 5% of the battalion's equipment ever makes it out of Kunuri. The surviving elements of 2nd Infantry Division consolidate south of Sunshan, clear of enemy fire. The division itself is combat ineffective, having taken over 50% casualties in the course of the fighting. The division suffered over 4,000 casualties since the Chinese offensive began, 3 times the number of casualties suffered by the 25th ID, which had the second highest casualty count in this phase of the conflict. General Kaiser himself is relieved a week later. Now, looking at the bigger picture, MacArthur realized by the 3rd day of the Chinese offensive, that is the 28th of November, that there was a major crisis developing in Korea. So he called the conference in Tokyo, and Generals Walker and Almond joined him. Talking with his subordinates, MacArthur is still confident that he can hold the waist of Korea, that is, the narrow portion of the peninsula between Pyongyang and Wonsan. But in his communications with external organizations, MacArthur is far more pessimistic, both to Washington and to the press at large. Walker at this time thinks he can hold Pyongyang, and General Almond is optimistic, but that's because the Chinese offensive that slammed into 10th Corps wouldn't hit until later that night. When Walker returned, and after 2 ID's harrowing run through the gauntlet the night of the 30th of September, his outlook changed dramatically for the worse, and he ordered his forces to pull back to Pyongyang, some 30 miles south by air from the front lines near Sunshan, with the 1st Cavalry Division and 27th British Brigades serving as rear guards. MacArthur, meanwhile, is desperately asking for more troops, but there are none to be had. The only troops on the peninsula that he might employ are elements of 3rd Infantry Division, assigned to 10th Corps and guarding the ports of Wonsan and Hungham, which are key to supplying all of 10th Corps. However, the road network between Hungham and Pyongyang is of poor quality, and given the North Korean guerrilla units operating in the area and to the south, MacArthur is reluctant to divert these troops. MacArthur asks the Joint Chiefs of Staff, quote, "The nationalist Chinese armies on Formosa represent the only source of potential trained reinforcements available for early commitment. Troops drawn from this source could be landed in Korea in approximately 14 days, and a much larger force than that originally offered would undoubtedly be made available if desired. I strongly recommend that the theater commander, that is, himself, be authorized to negotiate direct with the Chinese government authorities on Formosa for the movement north and incorporation in the UNC of such Chinese units as may be available and desirable for reinforcing our position in Korea." End quote. They respond, quote, "Your proposal is being considered. It involves worldwide consequences. We will have to consider the possibility that it would disrupt the united position of the nations associated with us in the UN and leave us isolated. It may be wholly unacceptable to the Commonwealth countries to have their forces employed with nationalist Chinese. It might extend hostilities to Formosa and other areas. Incidentally, our position of leadership in the Far East is being most seriously compromised in the UN. The utmost care would be necessary to avoid the disruption of the essential Allied lineup in that organization." End quote. Not only that, the Joint Chiefs considered Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese forces to be mostly worthless. After all, they couldn't stop the Chinese communists in the Civil War, despite massive material assistance, and employing those forces had a significant downside if it widened the war and alienated the U.S.'s allies. The only U.S. forces that could possibly reinforce MacArthur would be the 82nd Airborne Division from Fort Bragg, North Carolina. However, the Joint Chiefs don't want to commit that force, as it is the only reserve force available to the U.S. Army anywhere in the world. And again, with the Cold War going on and tensions high, the Joint Chiefs and the higher-ups are very concerned about a war breaking out in Europe and wanting to guard against that possibility. Now, 4 National Guard divisions could be mobilized by June 1951 and 2 more by September 1951, but apart from a World War II-style mass mobilization, the cupboard is bare. MacArthur begins agitating for the authority to launch airstrikes into Manchuria, claiming that being unable to do so is giving the Chinese communists a sanctuary to prepare their forces for operations. As he put it, such restrictions were, quote, "an enormous handicap without precedent in military operations," end quote. Meanwhile, at a press conference, President Truman is asked if the atomic bomb is being considered for use in Korea. He replies that it is under consideration, more out of a desire to avoid being boxed into a position rather than an active consideration for its use, But this alarms the British, who fear widening the war and potentially starting World War III. As the 8th Army is withdrawing, the rear guard remains under heavy pressure from the Chinese. On December 2nd, aerial spotters report some 8,000 Chinese soldiers advancing towards the 1st Cavalry Division, ominously reporting, quote, "The ground seemed to be moving," end quote, at the large numbers of Chinese infantry advancing in the daylight. However, UN air power and artillery fire inflicts a heavy toll on the Chinese and prevents any U.S. forces from being overrun. Regardless of this, the retreat is quickly turning into a rout. General Walker makes no effort to halt his troops at Pyongyang and officially orders the evacuation of the city on December 3rd, instructing units to destroy any supplies they can't take with them. One major from the 23rd Infantry Regiment remarked that everyone seemed to be blowing up ammunition and running about wildly, with rumors circulating that the 8th Army was going to evacuate Korea from Pusan. Everyone felt the need to get on the road and go south and keep going as far and as fast as possible. Traffic jams clogged the road, made worse by numerous accidents and mechanical failures, and the roads are clogged bumper to bumper, with rates of march averaging about 6 miles an hour, though sometimes falling as low as 1.5 miles an hour. In panic, some bridges are blown up prior to all equipment being evacuated, and disabled vehicles are pushed off the road instead of making any effort to repair or recover them. 1st Corps destroys 1,600 tons of ammunition, and Colonel Harry Fisher of the 35th Infantry Regiment said, quote, "I saw a warehouse burning. It had trench coats in it, enough for a division of 15,000 men, I was told," end quote. A B-26 bomber squadron at an airfield close to the front is given orders to evacuate in 3 hours. There is no chance to destroy or evacuate the radar or camp equipment. Colonel Gilbert Myers remarked, quote, "$1.5 million worth of equipment was lost for the lack of a few trucks," end quote. In today's dollars, that would be $20 million worth of equipment. Now, there are some leaders who try and stem the tide and apply common sense. Lieutenant Colonel Clarence Stewart of the 555th Field Artillery Battalion passes an ordnance dump south of Anju, with guns and prime movers being abandoned. He was instrumental in getting the men and equipment sent back to evacuate the guns. The 25th Infantry Division as a whole withdrew in good order, with mechanics setting up tents with warming fires to allow them to replace engines or repair tanks that broke down on the march south. However, these efforts proved to be the exception. In Pyongyang, there is a quartermaster soldier with trucks of supplies along a road, offering their contents to anyone who wants them. There are 16 brand new M46 Patton tanks on flat cars that aren't evacuated because they're missing some parts. Over 9,000 tons of supplies and equipment were lost due to unnecessary haste in the evacuation. Even a 2 or 3 day delay would have given the soldiers enough time to bring out most of it. And ironically, Chinampo, the port just south of Pyongyang which had just been painstakingly cleared of mines, is likewise abandoned. Mere days after the port was open, transport ships are now evacuating personnel and equipment, and the Navy opens fire on the dock to blow up the fuel tanks, cranes, and railway equipment before departing south. As UN forces are pulling back, massive refugee columns accompany them. These civilians are desperate to avoid being put back under a communist regime and fleeing in the middle of winter with supplies that they can carry on their back. As a measure of their desperation, at Pyongyang, the bridges are closed to civilian traffic, so instead, thousands of civilians climb over the ruined steel girders of a destroyed bridge, carrying heavy loads on their back. Some of them fall to their deaths in the icy waters below, but yet more press on. On December 3rd, the UN rear guard breaks contact with the Chinese forces and heads south, moving faster than the Chinese could pursue. In doing so, the UN forces are violating one of the key principles of reconnaissance, to gain and maintain contact with the enemy. The UN forces now have no idea how close or how far behind the Chinese are, and they're only able to rely on aerial reconnaissance, which produces inconsistent results, given how few vehicles the Chinese possess and their aptitude for camouflage and march discipline. On December 6th, the Chinese enter Pyongyang unopposed. It isn't until 2 weeks later, on December 20th, that the Chinese reconnaissance forces would finally catch up to the UN forces, now along the 38th parallel, back where the war started. Why did the 8th Army forces pull back so suddenly and completely from North Korea? Although Chinese forces had pushed the UN back dozens of miles over the course of the offensive, air and artillery fire inflicted tremendous losses on the Chinese, and the only U.S. forces that had been rendered combat ineffective was the 2nd Infantry Division, itself only vulnerable because of the collapse of the ROK II Corps on their flank. The British Brigadier General Basil Code, commander of the 27th Commonwealth Brigade, wrote afterwards that, quote, "A series of withdrawals now took place. One of these was in a 132-mile withdrawal from positions 35 miles north of Pyongyang for, as far as we could see, no apparent reason other than some ominous red arrows marked on the operational maps showing that the whole of the UN forces were about to be encircled." End quote. Another British journalist, Cyril Falls, wrote, quote, "It would be idle to pretend that the retreat had not had an effect on the 8th Army. In the 2 British Commonwealth brigades, morale was high, but the men were puzzled by the poor military situation. They felt that Western troops, with their wealth of military experience in World War II and equipped with modern weapons, should have been able to stand their ground in the face of the Chinese enemy, however great their numbers." End quote. I would argue that the underlying cause of this dramatic withdrawal from all of North Korea was due to the psychological shock of the Chinese entering the war instead of any material reasons. For the soldiers on the ground, ever since the Incheon landings and the breakout from the Pusan perimeter, things had been going very well for the UN forces. North Korean resistance collapsed within weeks, and now they were posed deep in North Korea with guerrilla bands being their biggest headache. Suddenly, they went from thinking the war would be over by Christmas to fighting a new and very different foe. The Chinese preferred to fight at night instead of the daytime. Their discipline made it commonplace for them to sneak up to perimeters without being detected, lobbing grenades or killing soldiers in their sleeping bags. Their use of bugles and horns for signaling further added to the eeriness, and the Chinese ability to infiltrate into rear areas and set up ambushes or roadblocks played against the innate desire of the troops to have a clearly defined safe area in the rear. It would take some time for the troops to adjust to fighting the Chinese, and they would learn to do so, and quite well, in the coming months. But overcoming this initial shock would require strong leadership to steady the troops and figure out how to adapt. Unfortunately for the UN forces, their leadership at the top likewise was suffering this psychological shock, albeit in a different way. Instead of having to face the Chinese in the dark, they had to face the truth that all of their predictions and assumptions about fighting the Chinese were wrong. MacArthur was confident that air supremacy would allow him to isolate the battlefield, that is, to prevent the Chinese from crossing into Korea in large numbers, or at the very least, that aerial reconnaissance would detect those formations once they were in Korea. However, the lack of vehicles on the Chinese side made this detection very difficult, and their camouflage and march discipline rendered aerial observation ineffective. However, even failing that, MacArthur was still confident that even if the Chinese did come south, there would be, quote, the greatest slaughter, end quote, because of the superiority in firepower and air power that the UN forces possessed. He likely thought of the countless times over the past century where Western armies have defeated more numerous Chinese forces, ranging from the Opium Wars to the Boxer Rebellion or to the Japanese victories over China in the 1930s and 1940s. And while superior air and artillery firepower did inflict heavy losses on the Chinese, MacArthur didn't realize that the Chinese would be willing to suffer those losses and had learned how to maximize the use of the night and infiltration to mitigate these advantages. With all these assumptions now proven wrong and UN forces in retreat, MacArthur's mindset swung to the opposite extreme. Now he thought there were vast Chinese armies able to move without detection across the mountains of Korea, which posed an existential threat to the 8th Army. His estimate swung from the best-case scenario of minimum Chinese involvement to the worst case, where potentially tens or hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers might be advancing down the mountains in the center of the peninsula, able to link up with the North Korea guerrilla forces there, and then turn, envelop, and destroy the entire 8th Army. General Walker never halted his units when they had withdrawn from the Chongchong River. He never told his troops to stand fast and defend Pyongyang or conduct a fighting withdrawal. Although he didn't openly call for a deliberate abandonment of North Korea, he did nothing to stop it, and he started developing contingency plans for successive defensive lines, starting at the 38th parallel and then working their way all the way back to Pusan, and that clearly communicated to his soldiers what he was thinking. In this leadership vacuum, the troops followed their natural inclinations to save themselves and withdraw as quickly as possible to the 38th parallel. In reality, the Chinese forces were exhausted and run down from their offensive. They had won a great victory in forcing the UN forces back across the entire 8th Army front, but they needed time to resupply and rebuild their forces. UN firepower had inflicted heavy losses on the troops, and while Chinese logistics were not tied to the roads thanks to their lack of vehicles, they still needed to carry most of their supplies by foot from Manchuria, and this gave the Chinese forces little ability to sustain an offensive for a long period of time. Likewise, a lack of motorization limited the speed at which the Chinese could pursue the UN forces. Hence, the complete break in contact between the two ground forces between the 3rd and 20th of December. A fighting withdrawal by the UN forces would have bled the Chinese significantly, buying the UN forces much more time and likely stopping the Chinese north of the 38th parallel. Thankfully, this blemish in U.S. military history is at least complemented with a counterpoint of heroism and resilience at all echelons in the face of adversity, over with the 1st Marine Division at the Chosin Reservoir. We'll discuss all that and more on the next episode of the Wheels of History podcast. If you know anyone out there who might be interested, please share this podcast with them. Also, if you enjoyed this series, please support the Wheels of History podcast. You can support the podcast on Patreon, though if you can, please avoid doing so through an iOS device, as Apple tacks on an additional surcharge for purchases and subscriptions. For just $5, less than the cost of a Subway sandwich, you can gain access to a bonus episode covering more details on the sources I researched for the series and my experiences being stationed in Korea. Thank you very much, have a great day, and I'll see you next time on the Wheels of History podcast.